recorder on. So big welcome to everyone. And let's begin. I'll ask Karen if you could commit today and our studies in these 3 one-hour sessions to God in prayer. Thank you, Karen.
Today, I hope that we all take the most from this session with Dr. Sam, that we stay vigilant, open-minded, and most of all, we take care of ourselves. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that. Olivia, can you just reflect for us on what have we learnt so far? What stands out for us in these classes that we're doing on critical thinking and effective learning?
Morning all. I'm still very overwhelmed with all of this, so I'll give it a good hard shot. The critical thinking is the ability to create
Now Olivia, can you turn your volume up a bit?
Okay.
That going to work?
As high as I can. Is it working?
A little bit, but still not much. But yeah, just briefly. Yep.
Just the different ways of critical thinking. Is being well-justified arguments, being open-minded when we're with the children that we are with, and not only with the children we're with, but also staff. Asking questions and analyze and evaluate the arguments, justify reasoning. And with the scientific method, it's an observation, like having a look at the observation, the hypothesis, and then experimenting with that, and then analysing the data and then coming to a conclusion from that.
So good. So I really like those points. They summarise it very well. That is, we need to be open-minded and asking questions. We need to reason things through, and then we need to observe, at times have hypothesis and experiments that test our hypothesis, and then we draw conclusions. And this is what we're asking and encouraging the students to do every day. And we have different styles of teaching. Some styles of teaching we might be telling the students this is what we know. Other times we might be encouraging the students to develop skills where they do art or craft or different activities. But then there is the importance of critical thinking, which is covered in this subject and topic. And it's important in our teaching. And it's also very, very important in your 3 or 4 years of study and more, if you go on to masters and further, in that critical thinking is going to be central to getting reasonable grades in your assignments. And critical thinking is also going to be essential to you doing well with your learning about the art of teaching and about everything that's involved in teaching. So we're beginning with these questions, asking you to write down, what do we mean by critical thinking? And then secondly, what do we mean by scientific thinking? And then thirdly, what are the steps we can take in using language in our thinking? Rachel, what do we mean by scientific thinking?
I think we were talking about it, I think either last week during the last session. It's more critical thinking is taking a step back and looking at it from almost a third party perspective, where scientific thinking is you've got your formulas, you've got your steps and your method of what you have to do, and you've got to follow it quite closely. So it's I think critical thinking is more taking a step back, and scientific thinking is more observing something.
Yeah, I like that. So taking a step back and reflecting, using a whole range of evidence, and then scientific thinking is a particular narrower approach in which we have these steps and methods, and the steps and methods that we have can include certainly observation of the natural world. So scientific thinking is often focused on the natural world of rocks and the earth, plants and animals. And science was broader than that, but in the last 300 or 400 years, it's tended to morph and change as a discipline, and it's focused on the natural world using very natural methods of observing and describing and data collecting. There is some debate as to whether these 5 or 6 steps or methods in fact fully describe what scientists do, because often scientists will have a hunch that they'll explore, and at times scientists may even work backwards from the result that they think they're working towards the question that they're answering. And so doesn't always go as simple as one would think. Certainly Gregor Mendel, in the development of genetics, when he experimented with peas, knew that if he crossed wrinkly peas with smooth peas, he would get certain results. It's suspected that he may have carried out his experiments, got his results, and then gone back to the beginning of the experiments he was going to carry out. And that's why his results look so wonderful, because he actually went backwards and forwards a little bit rather than following the steps. But certainly the steps are there. You pose a question, you observe the natural world. And if you take a scientific approach to teaching, you can ask questions about the teaching, you can observe, you can gather data, you can put forward a hypothesis, then you can test the hypothesis, and you can draw conclusions on that. And in science, they love mathematics. If you ever want to publish a scientific paper and you can put in some graphs and numbers, then it will make it look very, very impressive. So that can be very, very helpful. Hannah, what are your thoughts on scientific thinking and its method?
Yeah, so for scientific thinking, I kind of had it more as a focused approach to, like, you've got similar steps in a way to critical thinking, like you observe, you like analyze the data, collate it all, and then you like either work on solutions or get your conclusion. But with a scientific approach, I find it's more specific. Like you said, you're either got an answer that you're looking for and you have to work the question and do the steps to it, or you have a question that you want to go through and you go, and it's like a focused approach to it. So you are looking specifically at the data that you want and need, not at the whole situation as such.
Yeah, I think that's right. A broader critical thinking in politics or in language and literature would consider history, it would consider ethics. There are all sorts of other areas that we could consider: aesthetics and feelings, moods, emotions. Whereas scientific thinking, often they seek to narrow it down enormously. And so psychological thinking would focus on particular ways of carrying out that particular psychological approach. A study with chemicals and how they affect your thinking would look at these chemicals and tablets that people take. So it's very focused and very specific. And I think that's one of the strengths of the scientific approach, is the way that it narrows down its area of study. And often you want only one variable. And so you try and have everything else controlled. And so if you're wanting to understand whether people sleep better by drinking milk before they go to bed, then you'd have people drink some water and drink some other substances, so they could be the controls. And then you would have the people who drink milk, and then you would try and measure as accurately as possible. So you might get people to go to sleep holding a spoon in their hand, and then you might measure when the spoon drops from their hand as they fall asleep. So that might be one measure. And then you'd get them to record when they wake up. And so that would be another measure. And so you'd have these numbers look impressive. And then you would have this one variable. And that's been very, very successful with medical studies, very, very successful in understanding the natural world. but there could also be some limits on science. And so, Nell, do you have any thoughts on the limits of science? So if we use science to describe so much about the world around us by narrowly focusing on one area, Nell, can you think of any limits of the scientific approach?
Sorry, haven't got much of a voice at the moment. I like that science gives us so many different options. I understand that it's focused and narrowed down, but I don't think there really is an end to some of the answers that you can get. You can always change something to come out with a different outcome.
Yeah, I like that.
So I feel that it can leave you very open-minded as well. I don't think that it actually has a closed answer.
Yes, so that's one of the challenges in working with science, is the open-minded nature of it. Marissa, do you have any thoughts on the strengths and the limits of scientific approaches for understanding people, for understanding the world, understanding the class?
I like that. Obviously, everyone else has sort of said quite similar things, but the scientific thinking is measured, it's observational, hypothesizing, data collection, replication of findings is quite important too, because scrutiny is welcomed usually in science. You know, they want their peers to be able to replicate the things that they have found, and when they can't, they welcome that discussion around, okay, well, what else do we need to look at here, kind of thing. It's evidence-based, yeah, and like you said before, that critical thinking, just outside of that scientific thinking, it does take into account things more like, you know, your awareness of your own biases is something that you should be aware of, and then the history, and yeah, I mean, but there's obviously overlap in there, like peer input is important, our own pre-knowledge, things like that, so that way we can, you know, like, why is our view actually justified and how can we justify that?
Yeah, so we do have the strengths of science that you described very well there. And then we have that which goes beyond science, which could be history in the past. And this raises the question, is there a science of history that can study? And there's archaeology, and there are other sciences that engage with history. Another one would be economics and finance. And so can we scientifically examine the way economics and finance works? And that's possibly true. Awareness of the self. One of the things that science doesn't necessarily always do is things like art, music, and also the emotions. And you can describe in scientific ways what's happening with the emotions. That's very, very valuable. But are there other ways that we could engage with the emotions, like poetry, drama, dance? Again, you could look at those scientifically, but the nature of the human person can go much further. And then when it comes to religion and God, you can look at this scientifically, and this has led universities to introduce the study of religion, and they'll do the sociology of religion and the psychology of religion. And yet this can be a bit different to other ways of knowing about God. When we praise, when we worship, when we pray, you can examine them scientifically, and you can actually show that people often have a lot of health benefits from praise and worship and prayer. But does this fully describe what is going on? People in France in particular have developed phenomenology. And phenomenology says, look, science is very good, but it doesn't fully describe the phenomena. So a lot of Catholics in France when they pray, rather than saying that, prayer increases the levels of dopamine or something in the bloodstream and makes me feel better, which is a scientific approach to prayer. They interview the people and they describe the phenomenon of the people. And so the people will say that when I pray, I sense that God is speaking to me and encouraging me. And so a phenomenological study will describe the phenomena as it occurs, rather than just narrowing the science down. And this is often included in the humanities. And so the humanities subjects like English and history are sometimes separated from the science subjects, which are narrowly measuring chemistry and all these other scientific approaches. Is the humanities broader than the sciences? Now, back in the 1500s, the humanities and the sciences tended to be all together. So if you're Leonardo da Vinci, you could work as an engineer designing water systems, and then you could take time off to paint the paint the Mona Lisa painting, and you could combine science and humanities and art all together. Whereas today, they often ask you sometimes at school, you've got to choose whether you're an accounting student in business studies, whether you're a science student and doing maths, or whether you're a humanities student and you're doing English and languages. And so I don't know whether that's always helpful, but phenomenology seeks to go beyond the narrow approach of science to a broader approach of phenomenology. Now, of course, the question is raised, is science a good way to study God and Christian faith? Can I ask Hannah, what are your thoughts about science as the way that we study God and we establish a studies of religion course at a secular university? And we put God in a box then and tell everyone this is what we've worked out who God is. What are your thoughts on scientific studies of God and faith?
I think it's hard, like having a scientific study, as a lot of scientific study and research, you need to have it needs to be observable and repeatable. And when it comes to God, he's God. We can't see him physically in the world, so we can't observe him. We can't repeat what he does necessarily unless we're acting through him. So I reckon it's kind of hard, and you put him in a box saying this is what he can do, but he can do so much more than what we actually know. So I really don't know how to do science in that perspective.
Yeah, so good. And that's what phenomenology seeks to do in French scholarly university studies of people who have faith. It simply describes what people say when they hear God. Have any of you done studies of Karl Barth? No hands up. So Karl Barth is a German theologian who was concerned that in the 1800s that people were moving to scientific studies, and he's concerned about the idea that you could describe God in these ways, because according to Karl Barth, when you read the Bible, it's not us finding God in the Bible. It's about God finding us, and that the Bible is about God revealing himself to us. It's a bit like when a teacher speaks to us. It's not about us working out the teacher. Often it's about us submitting to, listening to, being open to the teacher if we're going to learn something from the teacher. Because if we're constantly telling the teacher, this is what we think, then we're not being open to the listening. So Karl Barth said that we need to move beyond this scientific trying to work everything out to humbly listening to God. And so his listening approach in his theology challenged everyone to think more about being open to God speaking to us. One of the other challenges we face here is the challenge between objectivity and subjectivity. Now, if you want to get really good marks in your essays, I encourage you to be objective. They get the marks, they get the grades when you're objective. So you're scientific. And so if you're writing about faith and God in Australia, then you look at the statistics on what everyone says and believes, and so many percent of people act in this way and they think of God in this way, and you do interviews and analyze it, and you analyze views on God in Australia, and this will give you really good marks because you are being objective and you don't use the word I. So there's a guideline for essay writing. Don't use I, the personal pronoun. Only use the third person. Scholars who study views on God in Australia find out that 5% go to church weekly, 15% go perhaps once a month or so. So you give all these facts, be objective. That'll get you great marks in your assignments. Can anyone see the weakness of the objective scientific approach to life? Is that it doesn't give a student like yourself or myself or your 25 children in your class time to be subjective, active agents who know themselves, who take responsibility for their lives. And so this then brings us the challenge with the scientific approach. What about the subjective? What about expressing yourself? Now, of course, you can go to another classroom where they're doing art and poetry, and then you can be all subjective. But I think in this class, we would argue that there is value for both the objective and the subjective. And so when it comes to understanding God in Australia, there's value in the objective. So many percent of people believe in God, and this is their views. But there's value in the subjective, where we say, what do we think about God? So, Rachel, what are your thoughts on this, the value of balancing the objective and the subjective in our teaching, in our critical thinking? Rachel, what are your thoughts on the importance of having a balance between scientific objective approaches and the subjective active agency?
I think it's really important to have that balance, to have the difference. Obviously, we're all really lucky enough to be in schools where our values align with what the school's values are and as an organization. But my stepfather, who's a teacher, he was working at state schools for most of his career. He's now just gone into private. That, he had to be really subjective. Like, all the kids and all the teachers and staff there knew he was a Christian, but he couldn't be as open about it because there is obviously some of that backlash that happens with Christian students and teachers in non-Christian schools, which is still really sad that happens. And I've had friends that have gone to state schools that have been really badly bullied. Some have even physically tormented because they're a Christian. So I think teaching the students, even in a Christian or, in a faith setting, that you need to be objective and go, okay, I may not necessarily agree with that opinion or something, but respecting that other person's opinion. Like my auntie, she's a scientist and is doing all the stuff with biology and neurobiology and stuff. But, she's a Christian in herself, but she has a lot of co-workers who aren't. So she's very objective, that goes, she's had co-workers that have looked into the particle that would cause the Big Bang and all of that stuff going on, that she's respectful that that's what they believe. She just knows in her heart that that's not what she believes and not what the Bible says. So, and teaching the kids the difference between that and going, respect people and still love on people because that's what God has taught us to do. But, and have that open conversation with them, but don't allow that to taint your own views and your own beliefs. Like if it challenges you, cool, great, that's amazing, but still go back to what our source, our Bible and our God says.
And so we can see strengths and limitations in this. Certainly the secular school has this emphasis on the objective, and it encourages teachers to avoid references to their own personal religious views and personal views. We see the same challenge in politics. The question is asked, should politicians be objective, or should they be allowed to express their own religious views? And the reality, some have said, is that you can't box out your religious views. They're part of who you are. And this is why many people value Christian and faith schools, because it allows people to be fully real about who they are, to not only be objective, but also to subjectively acknowledge their religious views. So in a Jewish school, you could encourage people to reflect on Jewish writings, and you can begin the day with Jewish practices. And that's in every faith tradition, you've got a greater emphasis on that. I guess the one challenge is, do you sometimes get too narrow? So if you're focused on a particular religious approach, does that make the Christian or faith school too narrow? Can I ask Mauricia, is there a danger in the Christian or faith schools because they can get too subjective, and it's we feel this and we have this subjective view of the world?
I think this is the thing about, we're all humans on this world, aren't we? And to make a blanket sort of statement about every Christian or faith-based school, faith-based school being too narrow, I think is sort of a little bit dangerous maybe. Like my local Catholic primary school obviously has Catholic RE studies, but they actually also welcome, like my own children, for instance, who aren't Catholic, non-Catholic or even non-religious students. And although they teach religion to them, they're also mindful of the background and their home life that they may have. And just, I know this probably wasn't part of your question, but just to sort of flip it, I find it really, it's interesting and personally sometimes quite challenging being a school chaplain in a secular school. But at the same time, that challenge, I feel, helps me grow as a Christian, because I have to meet all of these students with, like, without sort of saying too much in particular, there's a senior student at the moment who is having gender identity not issues. It's not an issue for them, but obviously my beliefs are that there are two genders, and that's sort of how that goes. But then my faith also tells me that I should meet everybody without judgment and with love and compassion. And so sometimes I think the two things can kind of lean on each other, if that makes sense. And as a representative of your faith, that you get to be a loving presence in the world around you, whether that's in a faith-based school or in a secular school.
Yeah, that's so well said. I think faith-based schools aren't all subjective faith. They are objective. They work with the curriculum, but they also acknowledge and give opportunity for every student to personally express their beliefs and to integrate their expression of beliefs through prayer, through worship, through Bible readings. All of that's integrated, but then they can also step back and be objective and say, so many % of people in Australia hold these particular views. And you mentioned interaction with others. We've mentioned the tripod analogy, which says that more views is often helpful, and it can be helpful to invite a person from a Buddhist background or a Hindu background or other backgrounds into the school and listen to them, so we get an awareness of different viewpoints. But at the same time, I think we have to land the plane, we have to ground people, we have to give opportunity for ownership of the students' own views. I think it's really challenging for some Christian students in secular schools where they're challenged to just be objective. And in some ways, there are people there selling an atheist agenda or an agnostic agenda, and really their particular views as well. And so that's really challenging. So in today's class, we began with a review. And in this review, we have considered some of the ways in which we began this course, reflecting on critical thinking, and then we've moved to scientific thinking. And now we're going to be moving on to the humanities. And in moving on to the humanities, we're going to be looking at the more human-based expressions and languages, what we're going to focus on today. So going back to our diagram on knowledge, we start with critical thinking, and often by critical thinking, we often mean scientific thinking, use of maths. In the previous class, we looked at expanding this into history, which includes the objective scientific study of history, but then there are other ways of engaging with history that are more creative. And in some ways, Lord of the Rings or Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe also engage with the way people think. And some writing of history is creative in that sense. So we often use the five senses and observation as the focus here in the scientific approaches. And then we're going to move on today to look at language, in which it can bring in imagination. It can also give expression to the emotions. So we're going to look at language as both a way of knowing, and then it's also a field of knowledge in English and literature, and English as a second language. And then in weeks to come and days to come, we'll also look at emotion. We'll also look at imagination and these other areas of knowledge more broadly as well. And also, we have our content sequencing that you'll find there as well. And so in the sequencing, we have graduate attributes that we're working with, which is looking at in any school more generally, or at Alpha Crucis, we're looking at developing our critical thinking skills, but also creative thinking skills. And so this includes the capacity to think and reflect, and it improves life of ourselves as students, and also the students that we teach and the schools that we teach in. So we're looking at various ways of knowing, which include the scientific way, but also include the more subjective, poetic, artistic ways as well. Listening and question are authentic and important in all communication, whether it be scientific or whether it be spiritual. Reading and writing are important. Reflecting on experience is important. And also we have professional knowledge in all of those areas. So in the 12 weeks to come, each week we're going to be asking you to look at a particular aspect of critical thinking and the broader understanding of this from the scientific through. And we're asking you each week to, beginning next week, you've got a week to do your reading, put in 10 hours, and then to write a forum post on that. And then the following week, another forum post. And then on the Friday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll get together by Zoom to have a discussion for a couple of hours on what you're learning from doing those classes. So we're going to go through the ways of knowing and the fields of knowing each week, and how thinking and critical thinking can be useful there. We've briefly touched on history, and in a few weeks we'll come back and look at historical context as a great way of knowing. And I find this is very valuable. You can go and visit Rome. I saw on the telly the other day someone visiting Rome, and you can visit the places where the Romans lived 2,000 years ago. And if people, hands up if you heard of Pompey. So history, one of the really valuable places to go in terms of thinking would be Pompey. So Pompey is under Mount Vesuvius, and under Mount Vesuvius it exploded. So there's Mount Vesuvius, and it exploded 2,000 years ago, about 50, 60, 70 AD. And people who saw the mountain bubbling, most of the population left, but there were lots and lots of people who didn't leave. They felt the mountain's not going to blow. And then suddenly the mountain blew, and it covered the whole city in meters and meters deep with ash. And so anyone who didn't go was buried and covered in ash. And one of the fascinating things is that the people who were buried and covered in ash, if instead of just raking the ash away, if you poured plaster into the gaps where the people were, because their bodies had rotted away, but their bones were still there, if you poured plaster into that, it made a plaster cast of the people. And then if you x-rayed, you can still see their bones. And so they actually have plaster cast. So this is the perfect burial in some ways. I mean, horrific to get buried alive, but most of us, when we get buried, the worms come along and our bodies are gone. These people here 2,000 years ago, we still have them. So I think it may be a gory thing or a wonderful thing, the Pompey observation, but the city's still there. You can walk the streets of the city. The artwork's still on the walls. You can see the artwork. Interestingly, had a chance to visit. Down one end of one of the streets, there's a brothel area and there's rude pictures on the walls. And then if you walk up the other end of the street, it's the higher quality area, and it warns against these things, and you need to live a higher quality life. And so you have these different suburbs in the city of Pompeii that are preserved. Anyway, history is fascinating. I've got entirely off the topic. Look up Pompeii if you want to find out more about this remarkable place and how people lived, because there's such a lot there. So history, don't mention that to me because I'll get off track. But Old Testament, amazing. New Testament, amazing. History in Israel, amazing. You can go and visit those places. I've visited tomb where Jesus buried, come out of. I know we had a person from Australia, pastor from Australia, went into the tomb and was so excited coming out of the tomb that he whistled with joy. And a Greek Orthodox person there, who was a priest, felt that this was the most sacrilegious person anyone could ever do coming out of the tomb. And so he chased him down the road. I'm going to bash you up. How dare you do so? So there were cultural differences as to how you would celebrate the resurrection of Jesus there. But that's snippets into history. And I think for the next 2 or 3 days, the Orthodox priest was trying to find this member of our tour group from Alpha Crucis. And the member of the tour group, who was a pastor, was trying to hide so that the Orthodox person can find him and bash him up for not being careful enough about expressing himself coming out of the tomb of Jesus. The big question that we're asking, of course, is what is truth? And we've reflected on Aristotle and Plato. And Aristotle says it's quite scientific, you observe, whereas Plato says, but so much is unseen, including the idea of where things come from, where things are, and so much that's religious and poetic, touches with eternal things such as the invisible God who makes all things come into being. Christian approaches, of course, recognize the value of the unseen, but at the same time, Hebrew and Christian approaches also recognize wisdom and the book of Deuteronomy, and that we follow the laws of God because he put those laws in. And Christian thinkers like Isaac Newton and others have said that there are laws of nature that we also need to follow and understand. And so in week 3, we reflect further on the nature of the Christian way of knowing. And then in looking at science, we look at Christianity's influenced those emphasis on science. And one of the fathers of science, Francis Bacon, is said to have focused on the world is made good and understandable. So science is seeking to observe and describe the world. But Francis Bacon says that people often sin. And because of sin, we need to be careful, have people check and double check our results. So the scientific emphasis on checking and double checking partly comes from the Christian emphasis on people are fallen and sinful, and we need to double check that. And in politics and law, some of the Christian emphasis that there has flowed through and said we need to double check that there. And then there is also the Christian message on hope of transformation. So religious knowledge, you can scientifically study religious knowledge, or you can subjectively give people opportunity to express the phenomena of religion. So scientific knowledge we introduced last week, and then this week now we're going on to the humanities and looking at language and emotion as other ways of knowing, and then we'll go on to art and music, ethics, good and evil, and culture in weeks to come. So there's some of the things that we're covering, and that gives some context to the subjects that we are covering each week. So today we're looking at language and critical thinking. And so we've done a review on what critical thinking is. So it's the capacity to question, to explain, to predict. And so I encourage you to reflect a bit further on what critical thinking is, because that's the core of what we're looking at here. It's a gift from God, the ability to think and to understand. And often it begins with questioning and then gathering information, evaluating and weighing up the information, analyzing. And then in the previous lesson, we mentioned grounded theory and induction, where we build from our observations and we code the data. But there's also deduction, where we move from our ideas down to look at the data. So critical thinking is about these various approaches. And there's some notes that I could put up each week. I'll put on Moodle notes from some of the classes, and let me know if there are some notes not there that you want more information on. I can put that up. So critical thinking is about observing, explaining, questioning, predicting, experimenting. Now, when we read, we should really be reading critically. So when it comes to language, language is powerful in helping us to understand. And when we read, we should be critical in our reading. And when we write, we should be quite critical in our reading. Do you know that language is one of the most wonderful gifts that we can have? We've got between 1,000 or 2,000 and 10,000 or 20,000 words that we can use. It makes us a bit unique to the other animals. And using words, we can reflect on the past, we can express hope in the future, we can express emotions. There's so much that we can do through the human capacity of language. In today's information-rich age, finding information is no longer the problem. That is, there's a huge amount out there. What we need is the ability to evaluate. So when we're reading, when we're gathering information, then we need to be able to read critically. Now, there's a place for non-critical reading, where you pick up a magazine or a book, or you see something on the internet and you read through the information there. However, there's also an important place for critical thinking and reading. And so to read critically, then we gather information and we evaluate the strength of that information. And a non-critical reader might read a history book to just get general ideas about Pompey. A critical reader would think, why did this happen? What were the responses? What does it tell us? And I know with Pompey, I've often thought, if you've got some prostitutes down one end, does this mean that the whole city was like that? But no, you can go to other areas there and you could start to ask questions about this ancient world and how people live. So non-critical reader, they're just gathering information. A critical reader is going to think about what is the position of the author, what is the evidence that's being presented, what are the claims that are being made. So some of the modes of critical analysis, we could restate what the person says. So we could say Jones or Smith say, and in your essays you might write that down. We could also describe when Jones and Smith describe such and such an approach, this is what they mean, and then we could interpret it. And I know in interpreting the Bible, I read, say, N.T. Wright is a New Testament scholar, and I could say N.T. Wright says that Jesus is expressing three different cultures. He's interacting with three different cultures. So there is the Hebrew culture. There is also the Greek-influenced Roman culture. And then he's also bringing his own perspective. That is, this is what God is saying. So I'm restating there perhaps what N.T. Wright says. I could then describe what N.T. Wright says. So Jesus, in referring to the temple in the Old Testament, he's referring to, and I could describe what's there. And then there's interpretation. And so, you know, Jesus, I could say, my understanding is that Jesus introduces a new understanding of a temple is not just where God is, but it's within us as a person. So I'm examining the text of the Bible, I'm examining the writings of N.T. Wright and others, and I'm interacting with them. One of my guidelines would be the more scholars you quote in a paragraph, sometimes the better the paragraph is. That can work. I think if you only quote one scholar in a paragraph, sometimes you're just summarizing. And if you go 2 or 3 paragraphs just quoting one scholar, then sometimes you're just summarizing that scholar. But if you were to interact with 2 or 3 scholars and then think about what they've said and put their ideas in that one paragraph, then I would think that would be more scholarly, because that would promote you to think more deeply and to interpret and to analyze the ideas more fully. So I think interacting with more scholars can be helpful to encourage you to analyze and examine the meaning of the ideas. And there's other guidelines. We say use more recent scholars, and we say use strong scholars who are well recognized in the field, who interact with other scholarly materials. So tip, an interpretation includes references to the content. So you've got to think, I was talking about Jesus, the context of where he lives in the New Testament world, Israel, the temple. It's a particular building that was built by Solomon. It was then knocked down. And then we have a second temple that is built. It was knocked down between around 586 when the Babylonians came through, but under the Persians, we have the beginning of the rebuilding under Nehemiah. And then we have the second temple being completed by Herod, who puts funds into it. And so there's the content that we can look at, specific details and actions. And then there is the language that is used. And so I'm talking about Jesus. Now, interestingly, I can speak about Jesus in 2 different ways and more. One way of speaking about Jesus is the historical person who lived back 2,000 years ago. Actually, there are some people, when I mention Jesus, would say, the mythological person that some people believe lived 2,000 years ago. I don't hold that view at all, because I feel there's a huge amount of historical evidence that the person Jesus lived. So we've got two views of Jesus there. And then another view of Jesus is the resurrected Lord who, from eternity past into eternity future, and particularly as we read Gospel of John and other Gospels, New Testament, and this is the Jesus that we believe and speak to. And so I've got three views of Jesus. So one word used in an assignment, Jesus, can have three different meanings. And so in critical thinking, we usually try and clarify and define the meaning of a word like Jesus. And so we would say Jesus, who is held by some to be the historical person who lived 2,000 years ago, and held by others to be the Lord. And you could even cite people who talk about those different views. And then it would be good in your essay to say, in this essay, it will be assumed that references to Jesus are, and you could say one or the other or both. And so it's good to define your terms in critical thinking. So definition of terms is important. Think about your audience. So when we're talking about Jesus, if it's Sunday morning and I'm preaching, then probably I'd have more flowery, excited expressions. And if I've worked out that the 10 students here today are all Christian, then I could speak in a more Christian way. Unfortunately, however, if you're all secularists and you all see Jesus as the myth, then I will probably have to tone down my language at this time. And so it's important to know your audience. And also you've got to decide if this is academic, then you've got to decide maybe it's best to write in the third person and not use the first person as well. Because that's one of the big challenges we face in writing, is that decision. I was even reading something that I've written on worship, and I've used a fair bit of the first person, and I thought, wow, if this is going to be published as a scholarly journal article, that might weaken it. So I've now taken out all the first person references, whereas I think that's all gone, and now it's all written, you know, it is thought that. So I write now in the third person in that assignment. So I encourage you, wherever you can in all your assignments, write in the third person. And however, can you see the dangers of only writing? Marissa, what's the dangers of only writing in the third person, and what's the dangers of that?
Well, I think then sort of what was the point in trying to educate ourselves on something if then we don't put forward what our own conclusion and thoughts are around something? And weren't we all put here for a purpose? And an expression of what we learn over time is, I think, part of that purpose, and that's how people grow from one another as well.
Yeah, so good. So education should include a sense of the personal. And so I think as teachers, it's good to encourage students and encourage you. So I encourage you to have a paragraph near the beginning of your essays where you write a bit in the first person, and you write about, you know, from my perspective, and you write about your upbringing a little. And then I encourage you about 2/3 the way through your essay to have a paragraph where you say, having looked at this, this knowledge means to me, and I feel. However, don't go on too long there and have paragraph after paragraph in the first person. Otherwise, the danger with the first person is that we often don't say anything. We just waffle on about, I feel that, you know, I feel that Jesus is such a wonderful person because he means so much to me. And every time I close my eyes, and you know, I could go on like that for paragraph after paragraph, but whether it would communicate a great deal of information is the question. So there's a danger in the first person, but then there's also the danger scholars believe that there was a historical person, Jesus, who lived 2,000 years ago, and this scholar says this about Jesus, and that scholar says that doesn't really involve me at all, and it doesn't develop, and perhaps that's not real education when don't involve. Any further thoughts, Marissa, on that? And then maybe Olivia might. Yeah, maybe Olivia. See how we go. Marissa.
Yeah, so if I mean, I think especially when it comes to tertiary level essays and things like that, if you are going to say this is what I feel or think, then it's always really important to sort of back up your statement with some kind of scholarly literature. So, how did you arrive at that thought or feeling? So that way you don't just look like you are kind of going off on this one-man tangent without anything to back up your reason behind that.
Yeah, so good. So can I get everyone to write down now, what are some things that have stood out in this session that we have just covered in this first hour? So just a sentence or two. We've begun by reflecting on critical thinking. We've then moved on to scientific thinking. And now we're moving on to the role of literature and language in expressing the complex nature of the human person. And literature and language can be very, very useful for giving expression to the first person, giving expression, I think that. So literature and language can be used in an objective way. At the same time, we recognize that words can have a number of different meanings, and that literature and language should be used to clarify these different meanings. And then sometimes people would say literature and language should include poetry and song, because that can express some of who we are. And then phenomenology, I mentioned, was an approach that helps us there. Tiffany, what are some things that stood out to you today?
So what stood out to me is that the facts about science, so that science can be used, but it does have weaknesses. It kind of goes back to what you told us about Plato and how there's so many other views. We may have a hypothesis, but sometimes that might change during our research or during our experiment. So we can use science, but also we can kind of blend it in and use both together to get to our end goal.
So good. And we could include at the beginning of our essay, this essay will focus on in a scientific way. And then we could say, but we acknowledge that there are other viewpoints that are not explored here. And at the end of your essay, you can say there are other viewpoints not explored here. Nat, your thoughts on what stood out in this session?
So mine was this morning looking at faith, God, religion, based on science. But then also looking at Karl Barth, and that listening is just as important.
Yeah, so good. So as Karl Barth says, it can be about listening, us listening to God, and that can be so central and important. Hannah, what stood out to you?
What stood out to me was like the use of language, and also like breaking down with critical reading, like breaking down, actually trying to think of the thought process of the author at the same time. Because sometimes I read something and I'm like, I just try and read the information and I don't take in that, oh, this person might be coming from this perspective. I've got this, and like breaking down the other reading, breaking down the other writing in a way that links to critical thinking as well. And then that defining the language, because like you said, a word might mean something different to me to someone else, which it happened. And I was like so tired one day and I said, oh, I'm really smashed today. And my friend took it as I was drunk. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Because to her, smashed means drunk, but to me, it just means exhausted.
Yeah.
So yeah, like things like that.
Yeah, and certainly in the classroom, it'll be important to encourage students to reflect on their use of language and what do you mean by this, and what's happening in your use of language. And as teachers will often say, use your words, and rather than just punch someone, begin to express, how do you feel, why do you feel. And one very powerful aspect of language is the ability to write. And so after the break, we can look further at the ways in which writing something down can be very, very useful. Writing can clarify. Writing can help you put your ideas together and help you understand what you're thinking. Some people say they don't fully understand what they're thinking till they write it down. And then writing can help to work through. If you've got to make a decision, you can have a left-hand column and a right-hand column, and you can say there is this evidence for and evidence against. So writing can help us lay things down. There's one of the real challenges in essay writing is that you're gathering. Well, first of all, you've got an idea, and then you're gathering information. And then when you're writing it down, things clarify and they can be quite different to your initial idea. And so often there's a change that takes place after you've gathered the information. And so often if you've got 7 days to write an essay, you might firstly in the first hour or so, this is what I think I'll do in the essay. This is the information I think I'll gather. And then you'll spend 3 of the 7 days gathering the information. And then when you're halfway through, probably that's the time to make a decision. Wow, my initial idea was quite wrong. Now this is what I really should be looking at in this essay, because you're halfway through 3 days. And then you really focus on that and you draw up a more ideal plan at the halfway mark. And so some people would call this a 7-day model, where you've got 3 days of initially gathering, 1 day of establishing where you're really going, and then 3 days really polishing up your assignment there if you were working on a 7-day model. Let's take a break there, and we'll come back after the break at about 10 past in about 10 minutes time. Thank you. See you shortly.